During my term as the moderator of the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church USA, I had the opportunity to travel all over the United States and around the world and experience both the great challenges confronting the Christian church and our interfaith partners, and to see our best expressions of faithfulness as well. Among the most memorable of those experiences was a visit I made to Tectung Presbyterian Church in a small rural community about halfway down the west side of the island of Taiwan. The pastor of Tectung Church was about my age, around 40 or so. He'd been there ever since graduating from seminary 18 years before. In the Presbyterian Church of Taiwan, pastors are assigned to their first parish, and the pastor, who was among the most energetic and creative pastors I met during my term, described his initial disappointment at being assigned to Tectung. When he arrived, he discovered that the small congregation, numbering only about 25 people, had been losing members for some time. There was a feeling of isolation, even fearfulness, as the little group of Christians confronted what they saw as a hostile culture, more than 97% Buddhist, and not particularly welcoming to the small Christian church in their community. The most obvious sign of the members' fearfulness was that there was a 6-foot-high brick wall surrounding the church property, turning it into a compound that could not be seen from the outside. The pastor told me that he knew no creative ministry could happen there so long as the congregation was acting from a place of fear. After being there a year or so, he pushed the members to tear down the wall that surrounded the property. Though such a bold suggestion would probably have led to asking the pastor to leave in many churches that I visited, in this case, perhaps because it was obvious that the church would die without bold action, the congregants agreed. Little by little, they tore down the wall on the street side of their property, eventually replacing it with a low decorative wall to mark their boundaries. Then they followed their pastor's lead to try to make their worship life as transparent as possible to others in their community. They removed the heavy wooden doors on the front of the sanctuary and replaced them with glass office doors. One member, a venerated elder in the community, arrived one day and went to work on transplanting a beautiful tree that he had planted some 40 years before right in front of the sanctuary. The tree, now pruned into the shape of a cross, had grown so that it totally obscured the front of the building, and he and the pastor agreed that it had to be moved to another place on the property so that people in the community could see into the worship space. Then the pastor put a large cross on the front wall of the sanctuary, and he lit it up 24 hours a day, and as if that wasn't enough, he put a pink neon cross on top of the church's steeple. No one could now miss the point. This was a Christian band of believers in the midst of that Buddhist village. Shortly after making the physical changes to the church itself, the pastor approached a carpenter in the congregation and asked him to build what eventually became a 3-story Swiss Family Robinson-style treehouse in a large tree on the property, which of course became a magnet for the children in their community. Then, in a similar effort to make the property inviting for teenagers, he installed a climbing wall on the side of his house, which stood next to the church. Several days a week, the pastor invited young people to come and learn the skills of technical rock climbing. Within a couple of years, the property had been converted from a walled compound of mystery to a place of welcome and a beehive of activity. Well, next, that small band of followers of Jesus decided to go out into the community themselves. They began a program providing meals for elderly folks who lived alone. They opened a daycare program for children of parents who both had to work all day, which was becoming increasingly common there, as it has around the world. They opened a computer lab to teach adults how to use the internet. And eventually, they struck a deal with the government to begin a school for problem teenagers who had dropped out of school or been kicked out because of their behavior. I've thought a lot about that small community in Taiwan as I've wrestled with the challenges confronting our own church here in the United States. We live in a time of fear. The fears have changed some since the end of the Cold War that defined my childhood. Maybe you remember, as I do, bomb shelter signs in the church fellowship hall and drills in our elementary schools where we practiced hiding under our desks in case of nuclear attack. 35 years later, in a post-September 11, 2001 world, the enemy has changed, but the fear that drives us remains much the same. My own son began first grade in the fall of 2001, and just as my childhood was defined by the Cold War culture of fear that I didn't even notice because it was so pervasive, it was, in a sense, the water in which we all swam, I'm aware that his time as a child has been defined by a similar culture of fear, prescribed now by the war on terror. Security alerts, travel restrictions, daily reports of death and carnage from Iraq and Afghanistan are all noticeable, at least at some level, to a bright 12-year-old. But less noticeable to a child, perhaps, are our slipping standards on torture, the steady removal of fundamental civil rights that have been our country's hallmark, gated communities that many Americans now take for granted, and even bigger walls and greater levels of technology to control the border, is the way they put it, where I live in southern Arizona. These are the signs that the culture of fear, the water in which we swim, defines our lives just as it did for my parents' generation during the decades of the Cold War. You know, Jesus had a lot to say about responding to those of whom we are most afraid. My favorite teachings for our time are found in the 6th chapter of the book of Luke. Following the stories of Jesus reshaping the laws governing the Sabbath, making it clear that the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, he then goes on to share Luke's version of the Beatitudes. Perhaps most remarkable in that chapter is Jesus' insistence that the only appropriate response to fear and to hate is love. But I say to you that, listen, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. Give to everyone who begs from you. And if anyone takes away your goods, do not ask for them again. Do to others as you would have them do unto you. Sounds pretty Pollyanna to a people living in the midst of the war on terror. But I believe that Jesus is naming a fundamental truth, that the only way to genuine security is through building right relationships with our enemies and those who hate us. Imagine how different our lives would be today if we had responded to the terrorist attacks that tore at the very soul of our people on September 11, not with an enduring war on terror, but instead with a never-ending commitment to development and justice for all of the people of God's world. Imagine how we would be seen in the world today if instead of spending $500 billion on the war on terror, we had chosen instead to spend maybe $100 billion on basic security in our ports and our airports, and $400 billion on access to clean water, education, dignified housing, and economic opportunity for 2/3 of the world's population currently living in misery and with greater insecurity than you and I could ever imagine. What if no one could connect the hungry cries of their children with the overabundance of mine? What would it feel like to live in a world where no one, here in the U.S. or anywhere in the world, is afraid of a terrorist bomb when they put their children on the bus to go to school or when they go to the store? Can we imagine a world in which people who live under U.S. or Israeli military occupation in Baghdad or in Hebron don't live in fear of a violent house search that will take away their loved ones with neither explanation nor just cause? What about a time in which no one in North Philadelphia or New Orleans would live with the certain knowledge that the violence of desperate youth in their community is going to touch someone in their family, somewhere, sometime? Perhaps more concretely for many of us, can we imagine a time when we ourselves will not be so afraid that we feel we must cower behind more and more security gates and walls, borders and checkpoints? I think Jesus had it exactly right. We will never find security at the point of a gun or a missile or as a result of a military occupation or a never-ending war on terror. Real security will come only when we trust that the basic goodness of all people, Jewish, Muslim, Christian, those of other religious persuasion or no religious persuasion, can prevail. Real security and a future of hope will come for us like it did for the members of Tektung Presbyterian Church when we choose to tear down the walls that divide us, to turn outward when every instinct tells us we should turn in, and to take the boldest of all steps we can imagine, to love those of whom we are most afraid.